The Boston Tea Party. The harbor was calm on most winter nights. The water moved in slow folds that reflected lantern light in thin lines. Ships rested near the wharves with their masts rising like bare trees. Ropes creaked now and then. A gull's call might carry across the cold air and then fade. In December of 1773, the people of Boston felt that winter hush, but they also felt something else. They felt a steady pressure that had been building for years. It was the weight of rules made far away. It was the cost of taxes that no neighbor had helped to choose. It was the sense, quiet but rising, that a line was being drawn across their days. To understand the night when tea went overboard, it helps to move slowly through the days that came before it. The colonies had long traded with Britain. They had grown under British laws and protection. But as time passed, leaders in London tried to collect more money from the colonies to help pay for wars and empire. They made acts and duties. The colonists read the new rules and felt the ground shift beneath their feet. They said they should not be taxed by a parliament where they had no voice. They said that laws should be near the people who must live by them. These were simple ideas. They were also firm. In Boston, these ideas did not stay in quiet rooms. They moved into the streets and markets. They were carried in taverns and on wharves. People spoke of the Stamp Act, which had required paid stamps on paper goods, and of how protest had helped force its repeal. They spoke of the Townshend duties, which had taxed glass, paint, paper, and tea. Some duties had been lifted, but the tax on tea had been kept. It was small, but it was a symbol. It said, in a plain and stubborn way, that Parliament could tax the colonies. The people of Boston took note. Symbols can be heavy even when coins are light. The tea tax connected to daily life. Tea was not a luxury for many households. It was a normal part of the day. Merchants brought it in. Families brewed it in simple pots. Neighbors talked over it in the evenings. When the tax remained, people did not only feel the weight of pennies. They felt the weight of being told, again, that their voice did not count. At the same time, the British East India Company had its own troubles. It had too much tea in its warehouses and not enough buyers. A new law allowed the company to send tea directly to the colonies and to sell it more cheaply, even with the tax. The price might have pleased customers, but it worried many colonists. They saw a trap. If they accepted the cheaper tea, they would be accepting the right of Parliament to tax them. They would be drinking a message they did not want to swallow. So Boston watched the horizon. In late fall 3 ships carrying East India Company tea headed for the town. Their names were the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. As they neared the harbor, talk in Boston grew sharper. Public meetings filled Old South Meeting House, a large church used for gatherings. Men stood on benches to be heard. Some spoke calmly. Some spoke with heat. The main point was simple: the tea should not be landed. If it were landed, the tax would be due. If the tax could not be paid, the cargo could be seized. Everyone understood the stakes. The royal governor in Boston, Thomas Hutchinson, had his own view. He believed order must be kept. He believed the law was clear. He insisted the ships be unloaded and the tax be collected. The captains and the tea consignees, men appointed to receive and sell the tea, stood between two forces. On one side were the governor and the customs officials. On the other were thousands of townspeople ready to resist. In the days that followed, small decisions became important. A meeting would be held at noon. A message would be carried to the ships. A letter would be sent to the governor. Crowds gathered at Griffin's Wharf and along nearby streets. They were not wild. They were watchful. They looked out over the cold water and waited for news. The captains were warned not to unload. The town's resolve felt like ice in the air. The ships sat as if they, too, were holding their breath. There was also a clock running. By law, cargo ships could not stay in harbor forever. If they did not unload within a set time, their cargo could be seized by customs officers. This deadline added pressure to each hour. Either the tea would be landed and taxed, or it would somehow be removed from the problem without allowing the tax to take root. People in Boston thought carefully in public meetings, searching for steps that were peaceful but firm. On December 16, 1773, the Old South Meeting House was crowded. Men filled the pews and aisles. Windows were open to let sound carry to those outside. The air was cold, and breath rose in pale clouds. Messages moved back and forth from the wharf. The people waited to hear if the governor would allow the ships to sail back to England with their tea still aboard. Word came, he would not. He demanded the law be obeyed. The tea must be landed and the tax paid. There was a stillness after that. It was the kind of quiet that comes just before a decision. People looked at one another. They had tried petitions, speeches, and careful steps. They had appealed to law and to reason. The answer, standing firm at the governor's door, remained no. A murmur swept through the meeting. Then a simple phrase rose above the rest: "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." As dusk thickened, groups of men slipped out into the streets. Some wrapped themselves in blankets. Some tied cloths around their faces. Some put soot on their skin. A few wore feathers and bits of clothing that gave them the look of native people. The disguises were not perfect. They were not meant to fool careful eyes forever. They were meant to signal a shared action and to protect names for a time. They moved toward Griffin's Wharf. The air was sharp. Ice floated along the edges of the harbor. The ships stood dark against the sky. Watchmen on board saw the movement and shouted. The men climbed aboard with steady purpose. They did not attack the crew. They did not drink or steal. They brought axes and hatchets. They made their way to the hold where the tea chests were stored. The chests were heavy. They were built to travel across oceans, but would break under repeated blows. The men split the chests open and spilled the pressed tea leaves into the water. The leaves spread like dark clouds and then sank. More chests were broken. More tea fell in heaps and slid over the side. The water carried the leaves away. The work went on for hours. Crowds gathered along the wharf to watch. Some shouted in support. Some stood in silence. A few people tried to pocket tea for themselves. The leaders of the action stopped them and forced the leaves back into the harbor. This was not a night for private gain. It was not a night for chaos. It was a night to make a point as clear as cold air: the tax would not be accepted. On another ship a sailor tried to lock a hatch to delay the work. A leader broke the lock, carried the sailor to the deck, and then replaced the lock with a new one once the job was done. When a man's tool broke, another handed him a fresh one. When a lantern guttered in the wind, a hand shielded the flame. When someone shouted too loudly, a voice said, "Hush." The quiet discipline of the night made its own kind of argument. By the time the work ended, more than 300 chests of tea had gone into the harbor. The decks were swept. A broken padlock was replaced with a sound one, so that no one could claim that the ships had been robbed. The men climbed back down to the wharf and disappeared into the dark streets. Some went home to their families. Some gathered in small rooms to warm their hands and share a few words. They were tired and steady. They knew the night would echo. Morning revealed the traces. Tea leaves washed up along the shore in sodden piles. Children played with them. Dogs nosed them. Customs officials took notes. The governor took counsel. The British authorities in London would be informed. Everyone understood that this was not a small event. It was a message sent by water. In the days that followed, Boston waited. Some people feared troops would come at once. Others believed there would be time for new talks. But far away, leaders in London read reports and came to their own decision. They could not let the destruction of valuable cargo go unpunished. They passed laws that colonists called the Coercive Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. The colony's charter was altered to give the royal governor more power. More soldiers would be housed in the town. These measures were meant to press Boston into obedience. Instead, they pressed the colonies together. Food and supplies were sent to Boston from other places as gifts. People who had argued with Bostoners in the past now said, "We stand with you." Colonies that had minded their own business now watched the harbor closely and asked, "If this can happen to Boston, what might happen to us?" Quiet roads carried news from town to town. Meetings were held. Letters were written and copied by hand. A sense of common fate grew. The tea itself was gone, but the feeling it had set free could not be gathered and boxed. It moved in conversation and in prayer. It moved in the way people looked at soldiers in red coats on the streets and in the way they greeted their neighbors across fences. It moved in a new habit of careful thought, in the pace of preparations for unknown days ahead. Some of the men who had taken part on the night of the tea told their families only a little. They did not brag. They had acted to make a point, not to make a name. Years later, a few would speak more openly. They would explain how the plan had formed, how leaders had kept order, how axes had been lifted and chests had split. They would speak of the smell of tea rising from the hold like a thick cloud and of the way the water swallowed it without a splash. They would remember the cold and the steady beat of work done shoulder to shoulder. For the families of Boston, daily life went on even as the harbor stilled. Bakers kneaded dough. Carpenters planed wood. Mothers soothed babies. Children fetched water. The difference was in the talk that rose over these tasks. Words like liberty, rights, and representation came more often. People argued without anger more than they had before. They asked one another what they were willing to do. They did not always agree, but they listened. The space between neighbors felt smaller. In the countryside around the town, farmers watched events with careful eyes. They felt the pull of their fields and of the wider world. They were not eager for trouble, but they made quiet plans. Powder was counted. Muskets were cleaned. Men agreed to meet at a bell's call if needed. These were simple steps taken in sheds and kitchens. They were not loud. They were steady. The Boston Tea Party is easy to picture as a single dramatic act, and it was. But it was also part of a longer story that moved at the pace of a harbor tide. It was a moment when years of talk became action, when patience held in one hand and resolve in the other. It was a start of a louder argument that would soon spread beyond the wharves to fields and hills and other ports. Imagine the harbor again. The sky is dark and clear. The cold sharpens each sound. Boots thud on boards. An axe bites wood with a dull clack. Leaves of tea slide and pour and drift. Far away a bell rings a single note and then is still. A man pulls his scarf up over his face. Another rubs his hands and bends to the next chest. No one rushes. No one slows. The work has its own calm rhythm. On the edge of the wharf a boy crouches beside his father. The boy has never seen so many people moving with one purpose. He will remember this night when he is a man. He will not remember speeches word for word, but he will remember a feeling that people can act together when they are sure of what is right. He will carry that feeling into the years ahead, when other choices must be made. A crewman on one of the ships, who did not care much about politics, watches his cargo spill away. He has crossed the ocean to bring it here. He wonders what his employers will say. He wonders if he will be paid. He also sees the care the men take with his ship and with the crew. He sees them replace a broken lock. He sees them sweep stray tea back into the water. He feels a wary respect. This, he thinks, is not theft. This is a message. Back at Old South Meeting House, the benches stand empty for the night. The floor still holds the scuff marks of many boots. A few candles burn low. The room has a hush that comes after a crowd has gone. The words spoken here have moved across the town and onto the water. The building rests. In the morning it will fill again, because this is a place where people come to find their shared mind. The tea will stain the harbor's edges for days. The smell will linger. But winter storms will come and wash the last leaves away. What will remain is a change inside people. It will be quiet at first. It will show in the way they look at flags, at uniforms, at each other. It will show in their steps when they walk past the governor's home, and in their steps when they walk into a neighbor's kitchen. It will show in their letters, which will speak more often of we instead of I. Years later, people will tell this story to their children. They will keep it simple. They will say that one cold night in Boston, men boarded ships and threw tea into the harbor because they wished to be free to make their own laws and taxes. They will say that no one was hurt, that no property beyond the tea was taken, and that the work was steady. They will say that the night was both quiet and powerful. They will end the story with a long breath, as if they are listening again to the water. In the present moment of the story, after the chests have sunk and the men have gone home, the harbor settles back into its winter stillness. The tide turns. A bit of ice nudges a piling and turns away. The moon hangs over the ships like a slow clock. The city sleeps with one eye open, knowing that a line has been crossed, but not yet seeing where the road leads. When morning comes, people return to their tasks. They also return to their meetings. They write new letters. They prepare for the closing of the port. They plan how to help families who will lose work. They send riders to other towns. They agree to try not to buy British goods until better days. They promise to keep calm and to keep talking. Calm does not mean surrender. It means holding steady while the wind rises. The Boston Tea Party was not the first protest in the colonies, and it was not the last. But it was a sign that patience had limits and that those limits had been reached. It told the people in power, with a grace that included swept decks and replaced locks, that authority is strongest when it listens. It told the people in the colonies that they could stand together. In that sense, the night on the water was less an end than a beginning. As you let this story settle, picture the final scene once more. The wharf is empty. The ships rock gently. The water folds and unfolds like a blanket being shaken out in slow motion. Somewhere a door closes softly. Somewhere a log shifts in a fireplace. The town breathes in and out. The tea is gone. The message remains. It moves outward on currents seen and unseen, touching harbors, farms, and small rooms where people talk quietly about what kind of future they want. This is how change often comes. Not all at once. Not with shouting alone. It comes when small decisions and steady steps collect into a shape that cannot be ignored. It comes when a community learns to act with both courage and care. It comes, sometimes, on a winter night, with the sound of tea falling into dark water and the smooth swing of an axe, repeated with calm hands until the work is done. Let the harbor grow quiet now in your mind. Let the lanterns dim. Let the watchman on the deck lean against the rail and pull his coat close. Let the tide carry the last leaves out toward the wider sea. Rest with the knowledge that the people of Boston found a way to make their meaning clear. They did it together. They did it without hurry. And in the slow rhythm of the harbor, their choice began to guide a nation toward a new morning. In the months that followed, committees of correspondence shared news quickly from colony to colony. Riders carried packets over long roads, stopping at small inns where candles burned late. In Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and many towns between, people read Boston's story and waited against their own hopes. By the next autumn, delegates from the colonies would gather in a Congress to speak with one voice. They would still seek peace. They would still write petitions. But they would also agree to prepare, so that their words would have the strength of ready hands behind them. For those who had stood on the wharf, the meaning was simpler and more personal. They believed they had acted as neighbors who loved their town. They believed they had kept faith with the idea that free people must be heard in the laws that touch their lives. They hoped that children would inherit not anger but a steadier road. And when they remembered that winter night, they remembered the steady way it had unfolded, measured steps, careful work, and the final soft sound of water closing over falling leaves. With that memory, they faced the uncertain days ahead with quiet resolve, trusting that patience and courage together could shape a future worth passing on.